Imagine the weather we've had the last week, and imagine that Eastern Front fighting in those kind of conditions. It's just incredible. My name is Don Patton. Thank you for coming this evening. This is the 27th year that we've been running programs, educational programs, and we think very topical and factual. Doug Becky is the curator of the Minnesota Military Museum, a great historian. He's done many of the interviews with the Greatest Generation Project for the Minnesota Historical Society, and someone that I lean on greatly, and I appreciate his involvement this evening.
I got an email from a friend of mine in France, and he referred to this location as Stalingrad, Minnesota. And he was here a few years ago and had that experience, and I'm sure he said it's rainy and windy in Normandy, but he's experienced Stalingrad, Minnesota, and so you know, it's quite shocking. So we owe a special favor to our speaker, who came up from a semi-tropical Fort Leavenworth. He's a former armor officer. He wanted to come in a T-34 or a Mark IV tank. His wife wouldn't go along with it through the Iowa steppes. But this is his third presentation at the round table, and the second time he's bailed us out, coming in as a substitute. So we're very appreciative for that. Professor Jonathan House is a professor of military history at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. He's a graduate of Hamilton College. He received both his doctorate in French military history and his commission in the U.S. Army at the University of Michigan in 1975. He's a retired colonel. He served as an intelligence analyst for the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Pentagon in both the 1991 and 2003 conflicts with Iraq. He's the author of Combined Arms Warfare in the 20th Century and the Military History of the Cold War, 1944 to 62, and co-authored with David Glantz numerous studies on the Soviet-German conflict, of which the most well-known is When Titans Clashed, which Axel mentioned we have for sale here tonight, which is how the Red Army stopped Hitler. His latest book, Controlling Paris, Armed Forces and Counter-Revolution, 1789 to 1848, will be published in February of 2014. So please welcome our substitute speaker, the hero of the round table. So keeps coming through for us.
Thank you for coming out on such a cold evening, but all good instructors know that you're supposed to start by getting people in the mood, and I certainly think this weather is appropriate for getting you in the mood. Axel asked me to explain what Combined Arms Warfare is about. Now, 35 years ago, the Army was trying to teach combined arms warfare, that is, how the different arms interact, so that captains would understand the sort of historical evolution. And a number of officers told me it couldn't be done, but of course I got stuck doing it. And that's sort of what I do in history. I am not an expert, with the one exception that Doug just mentioned of my Controlling Paris, which is actually my dissertation. It only took me 39 years to publish it. But with that one exception, I try to do a broad survey and boil things down. I don't claim to be brilliant, just brief. And there's sometimes a certain value in that. Certainly the Army lays great emphasis on, you know, if you can't give it to me in one page, I don't want to hear it, kind of thing. And so that's sort of what we're trying to do. And tonight what I hope I'm doing is not necessarily telling you anything new, but acting as a devil's advocate. Asking you to sort of reconsider some of our generally held beliefs about the Soviet-German conflict, which again I think Axel said really we should not call it the Eastern Front. Usually the winners get to name the wars, don't they? Not the losers. And so we should properly call it the Great Patriotic War, which is what the Soviet Union called it, whether you agree with that or not. But I want to ask you to sort of, you don't have to agree with me. I'm serious here, but I'm perfectly willing to back down if somebody wants to argue about a particular point, because this originated as a friend of mine told me to come to a conference and, quote, make trouble, unquote. And so that's what we're trying to do, ask people to sort of rethink what we think happened. And basically, I would submit to you that for the first 3 decades and maybe longer after World War II, we in the West did not know how the Red Army, the Soviet Union, with all its ethnicities, not just the Russians, defeated Germany. I say the Red Army. I'm not belittling the efforts of the Americans or British or French or anybody else who all did great sacrifice in yeoman service, but as a matter of fact, 8 out of every 11 German casualties was suffered at the hands of the Soviets. And that should tell you roughly the proportion of their contribution to victory. And so the problem is that we really don't know what happened. Why don't we know what happened? Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, the Army General Staff, the one that really matters historically, during the glory years of German expansion. He was relieved by Adolf Hitler in the fall of 1942. At the end of the war, Franz Halder, along with several hundred other German generals, became our prisoners and eventually our employees. Most people are not aware of this, and that is that when the U.S. Army set out to write its history of World War II, which is magnificent, many of you know it's over 100 volumes of the Green Book series, which within the confines of institutional history, they really do say pretty accurately what people thought. I'm very proud of the Center of Military History, which I used to work for at one point, that as long as you say it politely, you can say almost anything and the Army will back you up, even if it's not popular. But in any case, what happened was that we employed these Germans to write us their version of what happened, their understanding of their part in the war. They did it, I must say, mostly from memory, because we did not have the records. Indeed, we thought most of the records were lost until about 20 years ago when East Germany fell apart, and we found that the East Germans did, in fact, have at least copies of a lot of the documents that people thought had always been lost. What these generals did, and they did it sincerely, I'm not going to try to tell you they were lying or anything else, is they tried to reconstruct for us their understanding of what happened. And this is essential if you want to do military history. You cannot do a good history if you don't have the views of all the participants. I don't know how we're ever going to get a really clear understanding of the Iraqi or Afghan wars, because we're never really going to understand what our various opponents were thinking, do we? So we had commissioned the Germans to do this, and Franz Halder, in fact, is by name acknowledged in the introduction to one of the 2 published U.S. Army volumes on the Soviet-German conflict. And he's the first name mentioned in the acknowledgments as helping them, because he acted as sort of the editor of this whole effort. And they told us what they thought happened. As I said, I'm not accusing anybody of lying. I have no doubt that they really believe this. What we tended to forget, however, and I think this is something, one of the few things I've learned in my life, is that over time our mind rearranges our memories. Particularly if you have been in a failure or a mistake or an embarrassing situation, it's human nature that we rearrange our memories to make more sense of that, to make us feel like, well, we really weren't as stupid as maybe we were. And we then, this is just, I've observed this. I've known battalion commanders who lost contact with reality about that, okay? And it's one of the things that's hard to recognize, but all I'm trying to say is that what we believe happened is not necessarily what really happened. I think attorneys will tell you that the worst witness in the world is the eyewitness, because the eyewitness often has preconceived notions and doesn't necessarily tell you what happened. Well, anyhow, the Germans told us what they thought had happened. And their explanation was so sensible, and they were so professional and friendly and helpful. And by contrast, the Soviets were so churlish and suspicious, and then there's the Russian language barrier, that we came to naturally believe that the Germans were right, and we didn't even bother to look at what the Soviets were saying. Because most Soviet accounts that were written, the first paragraph always said how great Comrade Stalin or Comrade Khrushchev was in leading us in the war, and the last paragraph always talked about the value of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Well, you read that and you say, this is propaganda, why don't we care? Where what actually turns out to be is that in between those 2 paragraphs, often what they chose to write about is really very accurately depicted. But for a long, long time, nobody looked at those. And then a very few people, of whom I'm privileged to work with one of them, David Glantz, started to look at that stuff and compare what the Soviets said to what the Germans said, plotted that on a map and see what had happened. David Glantz is a retired field artillery colonel of the United States Army, and yet he is a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, which should tell you that even they recognize that he knows more about it than they do. Okay? But anyhow, the three explanations that the Germans have given us, if I can sort of simplify here, are as follows. That Hitler was an amateur who kept micromanaging and interfering with the professional soldiers. That the weather, as today, was so extreme and the terrain was so difficult that they just couldn't, they were overwhelmed. And that, more importantly, they were just hit by waves of Soviet soldiers dying, and eventually just sort of overwhelmed them. Now, there's probably some truth to all these things. I'm not going to pretend they're all lies or anything, but I think they're oversimplified. I want to spend most of the time talking about that third question, the question of force ratios and numbers and what's real and what's imaginary. But let me begin by talking fairly briefly about these first two explanations, beginning with Hitler. Adolf Hitler is the universal alibi for everything that happened in Germany from 1933 to 1945. You would believe that no one else made any decisions in Germany. And I have no doubt that people recall it that way. It must be very difficult to live under a totalitarian regime like that. But I hope we're sophisticated enough to understand that one leader, no matter how smart, and Hitler was smart, he may be, cannot really control everything. He sets the overall policy. He may set up structures of competing bureaucracies to make sure they don't cheat, which is what Hitler was good for, and Stalin as well. But he can't make every decision. Take, for example, the horrible subject of the Holocaust, and I'm reluctant to bring it up, but we can't talk about this subject and not consider the Holocaust, right? People tend to assume that Adolf Hitler is solely responsible for the extermination of the Jewish race. And again, I have no doubt that people remember it that way, but if you actually start looking at it, before we get into this, we find that while he certainly intended to do that, there are an awful lot of other people involved. There is, for example, the Wannsee Conference in January of 42, I believe it is, where sort of all the different agencies of the German government get together and decide how and in what order and by what means they're going to kill the Jewish people and what exceptions there may be. And as far as I know, I'm not an expert, Adolf Hitler didn't even know that meeting happened. I'm not saying that he didn't know what was going on. Of course he knew. But that there are other people involved. And yet our recollections when things go bad is to tend to blame one person and just excuse ourselves from everything else. This is particularly true, this sort of using Hitler as an alibi, when we talk about German generals. This is the conclusion of Erich von Manstein's memoirs, Lost Victories. Now there's an evocative title. Right away it tells you what he's trying to argue, isn't he? That if Hitler had only butted out, the professionals like Manstein, of course, which we have only his word for it, could have won the war. In other words, and this is a frequent allegation, if that amateur Hitler had simply not interfered, if he'd not insisted on holding troops out to defend in the West and things like that, we, the professional soldiers of Germany, could at least have achieved a stalemate and maybe even defeated the Red Army. Well, there's a number of problems with this. I am by no means an apologist for Adolf Hitler. He is a genocidal maniac. The world is better without him. Don't want to belittle for any or minimize for any moment what he did wrong. But I think a lot of if you stop and look at it, this argument really doesn't terribly hold water. For two reasons. First of all, well into 1943, in instances, and I'll give you an example later, even in 1944, Hitler listened to his commanders. And sometimes even when he would assert something, if they would argue back with him, and Manstein's got a record of doing this for about 2 years before Hitler finally very politely relieved him, but Hitler would say, okay, do it your way. all of his generals agreed with him that they could easily defeat the Soviet Union, that they could knock it out in a matter of literally weeks, and that, in fact, although I have no doubt that Hitler would have invaded the Soviet Union without it, the German generals tend to forget that they were involved in the decision to do so. In fact, I found in the German official history, which is a marvelous study been published over the last decade, that Brauchitsch, who is the commander of the German army in 1940, is the man who actually urges Hitler to start the planning process to invade the Soviet Union even before they fought the Battle of Britain. Well, but they tend not to remember that. The only people in the German professional force that did not agree with this idea that we can knock the Soviets out. And why? Because, well, the Soviets have been a bunch of stumble bumps. They barely managed to occupy eastern Poland. They got stopped cold by the Finns. They've been purged, all kinds of explanations. The belief is, generally speaking, that the Soviets will just fall apart. The only people that disagreed with this were the logisticians, the supply guys. There's a cliche that many of you perhaps know about military, that amateurs talk about tactics and professionals talk about logistics, because it is the logistical considerations often that trip you up. And what we have in this case is that the general staff planners, the logistical planners, studied this in the fall of 1940, and then they went to Franz Halder. As far as I know, they did not talk to Hitler. They talked to Halder, the man I introduced before as the chief of the German general staff, and they said, I don't think we can get there from here. And what they predicted, which turned out to be remarkably prescient, is that the German motorized and mechanized forces could get 700 to 800 kilometers, 500 miles roughly, into the Soviet Union, and then they would run out of ammo, fuel, and spare parts. And at that point, they would have to stop and wait for two things. First, for the infantry to catch up, because we tend to forget that 80% of the German army in World War II was foot mobile. Anybody want to walk from Warsaw to Moscow? And they have draft animals to haul their artillery and supplies. They're very much equipped like World War I, frankly. And until the infantry catches up, it looks beautiful on a map. You have these great arrows, and I'll show you some in a minute, where they've encircled the foes, but have you really encircled them? No, the encirclement's leaking like a sieve. The Soviet troops are escaping by numbers, either fighting their way out, or if they can't do that, they join the local partisan opposition to the occupation. And so they have to wait till the infantry gets there and sort of digests what they've already bypassed before they can move farther. Furthermore, they have to wait to be resupplied, and therein lies the problem. The logisticians predicted 8 months before they invaded, look, the Soviet Union does not have, and today even the Russian Federation, does not have very many railroads or paved highways. And the railroads, as many of you I know, are of a different gauge, a different width between the rails than the German and West European railways are. It's about, 6 foot 5 3/8 inches or something in the West versus almost 8 feet in the East, roughly speaking. 4 foot 8.5. Okay, yeah. So you know that you'd see the distinction, right? That distance means, and again, the logisticians tell Halder this long before they invade the Soviet Union. What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to relay every foot of that track. Move the rail over. Now, they didn't, as far as I know, explicitly say, oh, by the way, you have to assume that the Soviets will destroy all the signals, all the water towers, and all these other things. And if you're familiar with steam locomotives, you've got to have a water tower about every 50 miles just to keep it running. But they did say, quite accurately, you have to assume that the Soviets would evacuate their rolling stock, their locomotives and rail cars, and that therefore we're going to have to provide our own. And that's another problem, because even in 1938, when they were still at peace, Germany didn't have enough boxcars and flat cars to support its economy. And now we're going to dilute this stock, this rolling stock, over a much greater space. So basically the logistician said, this is going to be very, very difficult. And it's going to be start, stop, start, stop, start, stop. You're going to lunge forward, pause. Wait for the infantry to catch up, wait for the supplies to catch up, lunge forward again, pause. Start, stop, start, stop. And that pretty much, if you think about it, describes the first year and a half of the Soviet-German conflict, doesn't it? A lot of lunges forward and a lot of pauses. What we're talking about here is what the U.S. Army has taught me to call ends, ways, and means. The end is the desired end state, which is rather vaguely defined. I mean, let's face it, how could you really think that you can occupy the Soviet Union when it extends through 12 time zones halfway around the world? There's no way that anybody's ever going to be able to completely control that area, are they? So your end state is pretty vague. The Barbarossa order basically said, well, we're going to destroy the Red Army as far to the west as possible. That was their solution to the logistical problem. Just kill, get rid of the active duty Red Army quickly, and then we won't have to send very many people deep. And then push them back up against the Ural so far away they can never make trouble for us again. That's an awfully vague mission statement, isn't it? The means, the way is, of course, blitzkrieg, which they had become sort of enchanted with after 1940, and I can't blame them. It seemed to be magic. It certainly had its advantages. But, I'll sort of, spoiler alert, it only works if the other guy doesn't have time and space to recover. I mean, even after Dunkirk, for example, more than half of the German casualties suffered in 1940 are suffered after Dunkirk. Because the French army, which we like to make jokes about, was actually starting to learn how to deal with the blitzkrieg. If they'd simply had a little bit more distance, they might have actually stopped the Germans. And of course, we all know the Soviets have plenty of distance, don't they? Miles and miles and miles and miles. So the ways are not to it. And the means, the logistical capability, just not there. So they've got a real problem. And this is what we teach our students to think about in terms of any time you look at a potential operation, ends, ways, and means, and are they compatible with each other? Are they lined up? But it's not just the Barbarossa invasion in which the German generals are involved in making mistakes. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you the bottom line. Halder, after he heard this briefing, did what every operations officer I have ever known did. And when I was an operations officer, I did too. The nature of operations officers is you just sort of disregard what the intelligence and logistic people tell you and say, oh, well, we'll fake it. Don't worry about it. Right? Those of you who have been in the military know exactly what I'm talking about, I think. Halder said, well, we'll just make it up with trucks, even though he didn't have enough trucks to begin with. He had to bum various thousands of captured French trucks and Czech trucks and Polish trucks, and, well, that's great, but if you don't have the spare parts and the tools and the manuals, how do you maintain those things? All this captured stuff that you're using. So he just basically hand-waved it, and as far as I know, Hitler was never even told it was a problem. But the story is always told that Hitler rode roughshod over his generals, and he was the one who wanted to do this. But as I said, if you fast forward 2 years to the last great German offensive in 1943, which I spoke about, when was it, 5 years ago? I can't remember, 6 years, somewhere in there. The Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943. You see an even clearer story where there are some generals, Guderian, Walter Model, who say, this is not a good idea. Adolf Hitler himself repeatedly expressed doubts. He wanted to attack somewhere. Politically, he had to attack. But why Kursk? I could give you the explanation, but it's not really relevant. The fact is the majority of his generals insisted that Kursk was the best target, and Hitler went along with them. And again, does not fit our image of Hitler forcing everybody to do what he wants, does it? Even in more minor matters or lower level things, everybody makes honest mistakes sometime. One of the classic examples of this is Stalingrad. I think almost everybody here is at least generally aware that in November of 1942, the Red Army finally got their act together and surrounded Paulus's Sixth Army at Stalingrad. And the legend is that Hitler asked Hermann Göring, well-known drug addict and head of the Luftwaffe, could you resupply the Sixth Army by air until such time as the ground forces can break through and save them? And the legend is that Guderian said, yes, we can do that. And then, of course, he couldn't. Well, the problem with that little legend is that Adolf Hitler and Goering were in 2 different countries for the first 10 days after the Soviets surrounded Stalingrad. Hitler was in the Ukraine in his forward command post. Goering was back home because as Hitler's designated number 2, he had a lot of other functions to perform, and of course it was very convenient in weather like this to go home to Germany. Right? And so he wasn't the one who made this promise. The guy who actually told Hitler, yes, mein Führer, I think we can resupply Stalingrad by air, is Hans Yashonek, a fully trained general staff officer who's the chief of staff, the professional really running the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, under Goering's control. Now, I'm not trying to make Yashonek look like the bad guy. To his credit, after he talked to Hitler and made that promise, he went and talked to the local air commanders, realized they could not do it, and very bravely went back and told Hitler, I don't think we can do it, but it was too late by then. And about 8-9 months later, Yashonek committed suicide because he's had a sense of failure about a lot of things the Luftwaffe had done. So I'm certainly not trying to make him like as the bad guy. My point here is simply that our recollection that it's Hitler and the Nazi maniacs who are making the decisions, when in fact sometimes it's just honest mistakes made by the experts. But that is not the story that we're always told, is it? The other part of this problem, besides the fact that Hitler usually listened to his commanders, is even when he disagreed with them, he wasn't always wrong and they weren't always right. Hitler seemed to realize almost instinctively very early in this war that this was not going to be a quick and dirty war, which is what Germany was geared up for. That it was turning into an attritional war, a long drawn-out sort of war of annihilation. And in those circumstances, it becomes very important that you get control of resources. He goes after the grain in the Ukraine. He goes after the oil in the Caucasus. And things like this. By the way, I hope you realize that the Stalingrad campaign originally barely mentioned Stalingrad in the operations order. They were headed for Grozny and Baku and places like that, and Stalingrad is just mentioned as an aside. It sort of got off track and everybody got mesmerized by the name Stalin. But anyhow, Hitler, as I said, really sort of recognized that he needed economic resources for a prolonged war, while his generals are still sort of hung up on the political thing. And his generals, a lot of them are still saying, well, if we only capture Leningrad, if we only capture Volgograd, right? This week, since they just blow up the place again. If we only capture Moscow, the Soviets will surrender. Well, come on, back up. In 1812, when Napoleon defeated the Russians and occupied Moscow, did they give up? No. So what are the odds? Figure the odds. As I was saying, I think Hitler has a better grasp of sort of the overall objectives, nor is it possible, by the way, to come back to Manstein's point, the nature of this war quickly becomes so bitter that there's no way you can have a negotiated peace. It's war to the knife because neither side is going to tolerate the other side surviving. And of course, the most famous example of Hitler being right, maybe for the wrong reasons, is in front of Moscow in December of 1941, when the the Red Army, conducts a very weak counteroffensive when the Germans are overextended, and a lot of German commanders wanted to retreat. Hitler would not allow them to retreat, in fact, relieved a number of guys for retreating, and I would submit to you that he was right not to. He probably did it just because I don't want to back down, just sort of instinctive reaction, I never give up kind of thing, but had he retreated, they would have lost whatever shelter they had, and in weather like this, how long would they have survived out there in the winter in the countryside around Moscow? So you see, my argument here is that I just ask you to think about, is it really Hitler that's making all these mistakes? Now, since we're talking about weather and terrain, we need to move very briefly and talk about sort of the second factor. Obviously, weather and terrain are a genuine problem. But the Germans must have known what they were getting into. They should have known. And as it says up there, doesn't that mean that both sides are affected equally? The difference, of course, is that the Soviets have equipment and even animals that are adapted to that environment. The Germans have to learn it the hard way. Another one of the myths that you often hear is that the Germans had no winter equipment in 1941. Well, they actually probably had enough equipment for several 100,000 troops. Maybe not everybody, but for the combat troops that they needed that were out there in the front. The problem wasn't they didn't have the troops. The problem was, again, remember I talked to you about the logisticians and the problems with the railroads? At the beginning of November 1941, 3 trained German general staff officers, the chiefs of staff of the 3 army groups, North, Center, and South, got together, I think it's in Orsha, can't remember, and they decided, well, look, we have a problem here. We have limited transportation, just as the logisticians had predicted. And so we can either send ammunition and fuel to the troops at the front, or we can send them winter clothing, but we can't do both. Well, and then if you express it in those terms, the obvious choice is, what are you going to send? Right? You're going to have to wait on the winter equipment. And that's probably more important what happened rather than... But what that tells you is that it's all, not that they're totally ignorant, but that they're still, the fact that they disregarded from the very beginning the sort of time-distance factors, the tyranny of logistics. Real briefly, just so you get a sense of what we're talking about here, this is what the beginning of the campaign looks like, just to give you an idea. The blue arrows represent the 4 German panzer groups going forward, creating a number of encirclements. They got to Smolensk, which is 702 kilometers from the jump-off point. What did I tell you the logisticians had estimated?
700.
Yeah, 702 kilometers. And east of Smolensk, they ran out of fuel, they ran out of ammo. The Soviets counterattacked them, and they couldn't advance for 2 months. By that time, they realized, let's see if I can point it out here, that you see this big bulge down here. The Soviets were actually doing a much better job of defending down south. And a lot of people have said, well, why were they so stupid? Why did the Germans turn south and encircle this? Why didn't they just keep headed for Moscow? Well, come on, you don't need to be a tactical genius to figure out that if you got a bunch of Soviets down here and I just keep moving towards Moscow, what does that leave open for them to do, right? It's not going to work. So they really had to stop and clean them out. If you can criticize the Germans for 1941, it was their attempt to do everything at once. The idea that they were so strong that it really didn't matter. They could do everything all at once. They could grab Leningrad, they could grab the grain down in the Ukraine, they could head for Moscow all at the same time. That's pretty unrealistic if you think about it. But that goes back again to ends, ways, and means kind of stuff. So that's sort of the basic overall view. Now let me come to the third element, the problem element that you often hear about, that they're outnumbered. Okay? First thing I should point out to you is you don't hear the Germans complaining about being outnumbered when they're winning, do you? I mean, think about that. Even in 1941, at the beginning of the war, the Germans are outnumbered about 4-3 in manpower, 3-1 in tanks, more than 3-1 in aircraft. And the Germans get a very bad impression of the Soviets. They conclude that the Soviets are just a bunch of ignorant peasants. It reinforces all of their stereotypes about stupid Slavs and things like this. And no, I don't believe that. I'm just telling you what they thought, right? And so they thought, well, we're just so good, it doesn't matter how many of them there are. We can win before they even figure it out. You know, that doesn't matter how strong the enemy is, we're just so good, and our tactics and equipment are so superior, we can do whatever we want to. I seem to remember hearing something like that in 2003 in Iraq. But anyhow, the truth of the matter is that what mattered was not, and by the way, in the first 6 months of the war, in 1941 alone, we were talking about this before the session started here, the Germans and their Axis buddies invaded with slightly over 3 million troops, and they inflicted in the first 6 months 4.5 million Soviet killed, wounded, or captured. In other words, 150% of what the Germans came in. So don't tell me it's, oh, I'm always outnumbered. Obviously, numbers by themselves don't matter. What matters is, and many of you have heard this argument before, I think, that the Red Army in 1941 was simply unprepared. It was transitioning in everything. If you had to invade the Soviet Union, big if, this was the time to do it. Because we're all familiar with the purges. We'll never know for sure how many Soviet officers were killed or imprisoned in the Gulag from 1938 to 41. The Soviets are changing their doctrine, their organization, their equipment. They're getting a completely new generation of aircraft and tanks. But, you know, that's kind of a problem. Supposing you're an Air Force commander in the Red Air Force in 1941, what do you suppose will happen to you if one of these new aircraft crashes? You'll be lucky just to go to the Gulag, right? So how long is it going to take you to make sure that all your pilots are qualified in these new aircraft? You're only going to let your very best pilots fly on perfectly clear days with no wind, right? And because you're genuinely afraid of the consequences. And a lot of the commanders we might point out are very junior in terms of their experience because of the purge. There's a story about a major who ordinarily would command maybe 600 guys, who comes straight out of his staff college. I like to tell this to my students. In 1938, at the height of the purges, reports into a division. He looks to somebody to report to. Where's the general? Where's the chief of staff? And finally, one of the clerks says, "Oh, Comrade Major, I'm glad you're here. You're now the division commander because everyone else has been relieved." Okay? Well, if you are in that situation, particularly, as I said, when the consequences of failure are not that you get relieved, but that you get terminated or deleted or whatever euphemism you want to use, you're going to be very, very cautious. You're not going to show initiative, are you? You're going to do everything literally by the book in hopes that that will protect you at your court-martial. Okay? I'm serious. Think about it. And that's why the Germans get this stereotype that there's no initiative and no brains and so on and so forth, because it's just not good for your health to show initiative or things like this. But the Red Army is changing everything. They're changing their even their defensive deployments, because we were talking about this in case of the Ukraine. Remember, the Red Army divided Poland with Hitler in 1939. Well, that means they now have a new border to defend. So they disassemble the defenses at the old border, and they don't quite finish rebuilding the defenses of the new border. And they never quite solve the problem if that means you have to relocate your units into different cantonments and things like this. And so out of all this is they're literally, you name it, they're in transition about things. You can also imagine what a shakeup they went through tactically, doctrinally. First, they go to Spain and discover that what they thought was going to work doesn't work. Maybe because the Spanish infantry can't talk to the Russian tankers, I don't know. But then they watch what the Germans do in 1939 and say, oh, now maybe we need to take this armor stuff seriously after we just decided we couldn't do it. Then they get stopped by the Finns and they have to rethink their whole training and doctrine and so on. So you see, they're constantly sort of adjusting to things and they never quite get their act together for a period of 3 or 4 years. At the same time, they're losing all their leaders. So my point here is simply that I would submit to you that it's mostly this, the fact that the Red Army is going through so many changes at once. It's amazing they held together. However, if you fast forward about 14 or 15 months to the fall of 1942, by that time it's the Darwin Awards. Those Soviet commanders who have survived know what they're doing, right? Almost by process of elimination, literally elimination, okay? And so the Germans don't want to admit that. They've got their built-in stereotype that these guys are inferior to us. They don't want to recognize that it was simply a temporary set of circumstances that gave them this great advantage. And when the advantage is gone in the fall of 42, all of a sudden, the easy victories disappear. It's that kind of sort of dogged Soviet resistance with enormous casualties, plus the vast distances involved, that make the German objectives unattainable. Now, let's talk, as I said, still talking sort of at the wholesale level of overall figures. The census figures are very suspect. Stalin rigged the census figures, for example, because he didn't want anybody to know how many people died during collectivization and things like that. But roughly speaking, the Soviet Union has about twice as many people in as Germany does at the beginning of the war. So your average German officer had to know that, didn't he, going in? But as I said, it seemed to them it didn't really matter. We're so much better, who cares? In the short run, they were right. In the long run, well, that's another story. And more importantly, the Germans, even given their inferiority in numbers, do not have enough reserves and replacements to match, even proportionally, what the Soviets have. The Soviet Union in 1941 had 5 million soldiers on active duty and 14 million trained reservists waiting to go on active duty. The Germans, well, when they go into the Soviet Union, all they have are 321,000 18-year-olds who have just finished basic training in May 1941. That's their complete supply of replacements for the next year. And they run through that many in about the first 3 months of the war. Why doesn't Germany have reservists? Well, a couple of problems here. They're noted up there. As a proportion of its population, Germany was and is more industrialized than the Soviet Union. So obviously, if you need to continue producing weapons, you have to rob Peter to pay Paul. That every time there is a campaign, and Hitler sort of did this with a pendulum effect for 3 or 4 years, you call people up on active duty for a brief period of time, you conduct a campaign which you hope is over in a few months, and then you let them go back to industry. Ultimate example of this, again in the German official history in the boring volume on personnel, is that in May of 1941, the OKW, what we would call the Joint Chiefs of Staff, sent out a memorandum to the manufacturers of Germany who were complaining, why are you taking all my best people in the army? I need them to make weapons and other things that you want me to make. And so the OKW sent out a memorandum saying, don't worry, we're only going to keep your people for 4 months. We will discharge them by the 30th September 1941. Now what does that tell you about how long you think it's going to take them to destroy the Soviet Union? That they can start demobilizing in 4 months? Not quite. The other problem is the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. And then here I need to sort of rely a little bit on your memory. Germany invented the whole system of reservists that was used for almost 2 centuries in Europe. We never quite figured this one out, by the way. We always sort of abused the system. The idea was the Germans, while they were originally fighting Napoleon, said, okay, the Prussians at that time, we will draft 18-year-olds, train them for 2 years or 3 years, and then release them into the reserves. And we won't call them back again until we need them for war, which not only saves money, but it also means you can train a lot of people because if you have limited barrack space and weapons and things like this. Well, believe it or not, back in 1919, politicians still read history. Now there's a concept. The politicians who met at the Paris Peace Conference at the end of World War I knew this, and they set out to prevent Germany from doing that anymore. And so they limited, most of you know, I think, that the Reichswehr, the German Republican Army, was limited to 100,000 men, smaller than the German police force. But not only were they limited to 100,000 men, the minimum enlistment period was for 12 years. Anybody want to be a recruiter when the minimum enlistment is 12 years? Okay. And that prevents you from sort of cycling them through, right? Now, did the Germans cheat on the edges? Of course they did. Let's not kid each other, right? Anybody would. But by and large, the young men who turn age 18 in Germany in the 1920s and early 1930s never get trained. It's called the white years or the blank years in German history. And so to break the pattern. As soon as Hitler comes to power in 1933, he tells the army to start secretly sort of cheating a little bit more creatively on the edges. But he doesn't dare actually openly draft people and build up an army again until 1935. And even when he does, a number of problems set in. First of all, Germany does not have, even in peacetime, enough iron and copper and things like that to make weapons. They don't have enough barracks because all the barracks have fallen apart after being neglected, sort of like Fort Snelling for all those years, right? And so they find that they have a real problem training the people they do draft. And it's like, very much like some of you have seen the pictures, know about the U.S. Army in 1940 to 42, where you see people drilling with broomsticks and trucks where somebody's painted tank on the side because we simply don't have the weapons or the ammunition to practice with. That's the German Army in the 1930s. Not only that, but the people they did draft were sort of, they're not very big classes. Now think about it. In 1935, if I draft 18-year-olds in 1935, what year were they born in? 1917, right? So what's going on in Germany in 1916-17? They're blockaded. They're starved to death by the British, right? Not only that, but most of the German soldiers are at the front. So if Fritz doesn't see Gertrude very much for 4 years, they're going to have a relatively small number of young men who come of age in the 1930s. The French had it even worse, but that's a whole other story. Birth control is the #1 French national security problem in the 20th century, but that's a whole other lecture, and that's going to do that tonight. But and so they have a relatively under-strength group of people to train to begin with. And they draft them in 35, they release them in 37, and within 6 months they're calling them back to active duty to occupy Austria. And as I said, then you get this pendulum effect, back and forth, back and forth. And so they never really caught up with the backlog of people that they had not trained. At most, if you were a really gung-ho person or you had a technical specialty, maybe you're an electronics guy that they really needed, almost as a favor, the German Army would send you to 2 months of basic training in the 1930s or early 1940s. They simply never had a chance to build up the reservists that the Soviets did. Now, the automatic reaction is, if you believe the legend that every German is a great tactician, you say, well, it doesn't matter because the Soviets they're all over age and they're all sort of trained in obsolete tactics, and how good can they be anyhow? That, again, I would submit to you as listening to the German alibis. Because as a matter of fact, I mean, think about it. Where was Germany going to get the junior and middle grade leaders for this army? Everybody talks about how well-trained that 100,000-man Reichswehr is. Okay, got it. Every one of them is a future field marshal. But how far does 100,000, actually only 92,000, because they had to give 8,000 for cadre for the Luftwaffe when they created it in 1935, how far did 92,000 guys go as a leadership cadre for an army of 4 or 5 million? Where are you going to get the other guys? You hear people saying Hitler Youth. Well, come on. Hitler Youth's only been in the works for 5 or 6 years. They were only producing not very many people at this time. You get a few when you annex Austria, if you can trust them. You can put lawyers in a uniform to be your JAGs and so on. Doesn't really matter if you don't pay attention to international law, so what do you need lawyers for, right? But by and large, those only provide you with the key staff officers. Where do you get the junior and middle grade leaders? There's only one source. You go back to the veterans of World War I. Somebody who was drafted in 1917 or 18, and he's heard the bullets fly, and that's good. And he's a mature, middle-aged person. He's got some judgment and calm about him, and that's good too. But physically, as many of you know, when you get into your 40s, I can say from personal experience, you slow down. You're simply not up to doing the stuff that you could do when you're young and stupid. Okay? You cannot be a great power if you run out of a supply of 19-year-olds who think they're bulletproof, let's face it. Okay? So the first sergeants, the company commanders, the battalion commanders in the German army are mostly World War I veterans in their 40s and 50s. Even invading the Soviet Union in spring of 1945, 41, that personnel volume of the official history says there are 500,000 veterans of World War I, which means they're all in their mid-40s, in the German field forces, the actual tactical units. Back in the training base, they've got 70-year-olds acting as staff officers to run things. And that's in 1941. Now fast forward that for a minute, right? What does that tell you about the leadership of the German army in 44-45? A recent study by a couple of Swedes, I had not done the math, but once I did, I said, yeah, you're right, pointed out that the average age of a German army or army group commander, that is the senior generals, in 1941 is 58. The average age of a Soviet army or front commander, because that's what the Soviets call an army group, was 44. Both because of the purge and because the Red Army as a new revolutionary organization didn't exist before 1918. So that should tell you that, yes, of course, in 1941, the German commanders have more experience than their counterparts. But by 1944, they're my age. They're not up to it anymore. Okay? And the Soviets are just hitting their prime. So you got to sort of think about your groups and where you're going to get the leaders here. That's so much then for sort of the overall numbers. Now I want to do a couple of more things where I would submit to you that the Germans are exaggerating the problem they're facing. Not that they are not outnumbered. Of course they're outnumbered, but they're exaggerating just how bad the problem is. First point, I say this to you as a career professional intelligence analyst. I'm one of those Iraqi analysts everybody likes to blame for 2003, but that's another story again. Naturally, automatically, unless you know otherwise, intelligence analysts always assume that your opponent is at 100% strength, that he has every tank, every truck, every soldier he's supposed to have. If you do otherwise, you might underestimate your enemy, and that's really kind of dangerous, isn't it? On the other hand, you know what your actual strength is, and those of you who've been in the military know you never have 100% of the strength, do you? Did you ever see a unit? Did you guys ever see units that were 100% strength? You're lucky to get 85% on a good day, because there's always somebody who broke his leg, or some truck that's missing a spare part, or something like this. So if I compare the ideal, perfect enemy strength to my actual strength, I'm going to exaggerate how strong the enemy is, aren't I? You tell me, oh no, people don't do that. I was in the room in the Pentagon in 1990 when the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency agreed that that's exactly how they were going to count the Iraqi army, assume that every Iraqi division was at 100%. So this is reality. I'm not making this one up. Secondly, we tend to assume when we hear these huge numbers, and our mind has trouble wrapping around the idea of hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of tanks and artillery pieces and stuff. It just does not compute. I don't know about you. We tend to imagine them as being all in one vast battlefield. Well, a little thing called terrain gets in the way. Take, for example, the Battle of Prokhorovka. By reputation, Prokhorovka, which is part of the Kursk campaign, is the largest single tank battle in the world ever. I don't know how that compares to 1991, but that's another question. There are 4 high-priority SS and German motorized mechanized divisions versus 5 Soviet tank corps. A Soviet tank corps in World War II is a sort of an understrength division. And we have imagines of like thousands of tanks. But the reality is that the Battle of Prokhorovka is actually divided into 4 different battlefields. There's railway lines and rivers that separate it up. In any one of those 4 battlefields, the most you would find is about 600 tanks on both sides. Now that's a huge number, don't get me wrong. I'd like to see 600 tanks in one place, wouldn't you? But that's only the strength of 2 U.S. Army heavy divisions today. So it's not really that huge a number. And so our mind and Hollywood sometimes sort of exaggerate the numbers involved. Finally, and perhaps the most important thing I want to give you a couple examples about, is Soviet deception planning. The Soviet term for this, some of you may be familiar with, maskirovka. You can hear the word mask in there, can't you? You don't have to be a Soviet linguist to hear that they're talking about concealing something, like wearing a mask, true? And maskirovka basically is a combination of things that we in the U.S. think of as two different subjects. Operation security, how do I conceal from the enemy what I'm really doing? And deception planning, how do I sell the enemy a bill of goods, a notional, imaginary enemy? So he prepares for the wrong thing. And here's where we really sink down into things, because the Germans, of course, since you start subconsciously thinking you're superior to your enemy, find it hard to imagine that they could ever be tricked. No, that never happens. We can't do this. They're a bunch of dumb peasants. How are they going to trick me? Kind of attitude. And in fact, the Soviets tricked them over and over and over again. Not perfectly. The Germans usually eventually realize that they've been deceived, but it might be too late. I'm going to give you just two examples in the interest of time of deception. One sort of the tactical operational level and one at the higher level. First is a place called Korsun-Shevchenkovsky. It's a good thing I didn't have anything to drink this evening to say that one. Very simply, Korsun-Shevchenkovsky, we're talking about early 1944. And it is a case of, well, let me move forward to the map. This is the Soviet map of the whole thing. And basically, this black line represents a boundary between the 1st Ukrainian and the 2nd Ukrainian fronts. A front, remember, is an army group, 300,000 or 400,000 men of the Red Army. And near that boundaries, up in here, there are two German corps that looks, because of that bend in the front, like very likely subjects to be encircled. Now, the Germans are aware of this possibility, and they're looking for it. But the Soviets figure out a way to trick them. And basically what it is that Ivan Konev, the commander of 1st Ukrainian Front, takes one of his main attack forces, 5th Guards Tank Army, which is like 400 tanks, something like that, and he makes it appear to be in two places at once. First he has them attack down here in the south, make a minor attack, make a lot of noise, use all the deceptions you may have heard about in relationship to, say, Normandy, like dummy tanks, fake radio broadcasts, noisemakers, fires in the woods, things like this. Make a lot of appearance that the 5th Guards Tank Army is still there. And meanwhile, 5th Guards Tank Army shifts up north about as quietly as you can move 400 tanks, which is not very quietly, of course, but you can hide them behind other noises. And so the German 8th Army, which is on the defensive here, realizes after about 48 hours they've been tricked. And the Germans then redeploy their forces. I think this is 4th Panzer Division shifting there. But that 48 hours is decisive. The Germans don't have time to get set in the right place before the 5th Guards Tank Army and, where is it, up here, the 6th Tank Army start their encirclement. And the result at Korsun-Shevchenkovsky is one of the most painful German encirclements other than Stalingrad. That's sort of a tactical level thing. Now, as I said, however, need to talk about an even bigger one. Some of you may be familiar with this, Operation Bagration, otherwise known as the defeat of Army Group Center. It goes something like this. I'll show you the simplified map here. This solid red line represents the front in the beginning of June 1944. See how it bulges eastward around towards Smolensk and around Minsk down here? This is Army Group Center. This is what the Soviets want to attack. But the Soviet calculations, remember I told you we all tend to sort of exaggerate how strong the enemy is. The Soviet calculations say that they're only about 1 million men here versus 850,000 Germans there. Well, if your enemy is defending and he's 85% of what you have, there's no way you can defeat him, right? So you have to do something. So first they move in, just your minor little tactical movement, 3,000 tanks, 12,000 artillery pieces, 400,000 men, 4,000 men, 40,000 men, 400,000 tons of supplies, quietly concealing it. Meanwhile, the Soviets depict as a notional, an imaginary attack that they're going to attack down here into Army Group North Ukraine. Walter Model, one of Hitler's favorite generals, commander of Army Group Center. And this is very tempting. A good deception plan is to sell somebody something he wants to believe, right? Madison Avenue does it all the time. But, you know, if you use the right deodorant, you'll be attractive to the opposite sex and things like that. So Walter Model wants to believe this is true, because you don't have to be a tactical genius to recognize that if the Soviets attack down here, then all I have to do is tack like this into their flank, into their side, and I'm going to chop them off, right? So Walter Model goes to Adolf Hitler. Notice this is not Hitler's idea. Remember I told you he listened to the generals. And he convinces them that the main counterattack force of Army Group Center, 56th Panzer Corps, should get shifted from up here down to here to help defeat this imaginary shadow, never happened Soviet attack. And the Soviet deception plan holds, at least at the higher level, right up till the day of the attack, which is the 3rd anniversary of the war, June 22nd. Why do all the great disasters of history happen on June 22nd? You know, that's my birthday. What can I say? But anyhow, and then because they have tricked the Soviets, tricked the Germans rather, the Soviets are able to destroy almost 25 German divisions in about 2 weeks. They just tear a hole in the middle of it. Now, even then we have to be careful, because it depends on who's counting, what the force ratios are. According to the U.S. official historian of that campaign, Earl Zimke, a great man, but he's listening to the Germans, he thinks the Germans thought that the Soviets outnumbered them 3.5 to 1. The Soviets calculated that they only outnumbered them 2 to 1. You know what I mean? Because of all those factors I mentioned about misunderestimating, to use a good Bushian term, what the enemy's strength is. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Now, while we're on the subject of this sort of numbers game, and the Germans feel they're outnumbered, got to sort of talk a little bit more about this, because on the Soviet side, the Soviet idea of military science is all about numbers and ratios. If you ever had the misfortune to try to study Karl Marx, you know he believes that history is a science, and he has 3 volumes of tables and charts and graphs to prove that inevitably capitalism will come to an end. Well, okay, the Soviet military approached warfare the same way. It's all about force ratios. How many gun tubes did I have per kilometer front? How many rounds do I have to fire? There's a formula to destroy an enemy company or something like this. And they call this correlation of forces, is the Soviet term. And they actually used this for planning when they did it. And then afterwards, when they wrote the historical accounts, their historical accounts are full of these diagrams and charts and things. When over the last 50, 60 years, these reports, which were classified secret, have leaked out, and we have most of them now, inevitably, it looks to the reader like the Germans are right. We're outnumbered. You know? But I'd like to submit to you there's some other factors involved. Let's go back to the same Operation Bagration, if we can here. See this white line here? This is the Moscow-Minsk highway, one of the very few paved roads, so obviously both sides want to control it, right? The Germans put, I think it's 78th Infantry Division, a reinforced infantry division right there at the front just to protect that road. But the Soviets are determined to take the road. So opposite this one German division is 11th Guards Army. 5 Soviet divisions, each of them probably a little bit weaker than a German division, and a tank brigade. And what we're talking about here is, imagine a division attacking on a 1-mile wide front. You have 5 divisions attacking on 8 kilometers. That works out to about 1 division per mile. At that particular point, are the Germans outnumbered? Of course they are. They're hopelessly outnumbered, which is what they tell you. But what they don't recognize is that often they are outnumbered because along the rest of this front through here, they're using what's called economy of force. That is, they're stretching their troops out, And instead of one division attacking on 1 mile, one division may be covering 18 miles of front. So that they only actually get that enormous concentration, that breakthrough frontage, on 5 different narrow frontages. But again, that's not what the Germans see or think they see. So really, by the by the late mid-1940, 344, the Soviets have revived their pre-war doctrine. It's similar to, but not quite the same as Blitzkrieg. I've summarized it for you up there. Basically, you're trying to attack the enemy and disrupt him simultaneously at every distance using all the different tools you have. Once you create the breach, then you pass through a large mechanized combined arms force led by junior guys, majors in their 20s, who have the authority to make decisions, which again is contrary to our stereotype of the Soviets, and their basic order is keep going. Pedal to the metal, bypass, and haul. Well, you know what rhymes with that. Anyhow, and they're supposed to keep going. Some of them would go as far as 400 kilometers, and they ran out of fuel and ammo. They were supposed to grab a bridge hood over the next river they could find and stop, so they'd be in a good position to launch the next offensive. Now, how were they able to go 400 kilometers deep? Well, it helps to have 410,000 American and British Lend-Lease trucks, which the Germans would have loved to have. Without those trucks, the Soviets probably would have still won the war, but they wouldn't have been able to penetrate as much in any one operation, which means they would have to stop, build up, and break through, just like the Germans did a lot more often. Those trucks and the railroads to support them are one of the hidden reasons why the Soviets are successful. But again, you don't expect the Soviets to admit that American aid is helping them, do you? Come on, this is the Cold War we're talking about. Okay, so what I'm trying to suggest to you is that argue with you that the Red Army is combining deception, extreme concentration on a few narrow frontages, and then rapid exploitation of the rear. And that's what makes them so successful. And the problem or reason why we didn't hear this from the Germans is that we are dealing mostly with people like Halder and Guderian and Manstein and Mellenthin, who fought the Soviets in 1941 and 42. And the first impressions almost matter. Let me suggest to you a parallel situation. Supposing I want to write a history of how well the U.S. Army did in World War II, and my entire database is going to be that I'm going to ask the German Army and the Japanese Army, how well did the U.S. Army do at the end of 42 and the beginning of 43? How well are we going to come off? Places like Kaiserine Pass and Buna and places like that. I don't think we're going to look very good, are we? But that's our image of what the Soviets were doing. So then the obvious question is, it says down there at the bottom, is, well, what about the German commanders of later in the war who were opposing the Red Army when it was at its best? Why don't we hear much from them? Anybody? They're dead, or they're in the gulag for 10 years. The only exception I can think of is Erhard Raus, who was an army commander in 1944, respectful of the Soviets. So I'm trying to suggest to you then that we perhaps are looking at a biased database. The Germans then began the war with a lot of advantages, which they didn't really realize how much the advantages were helping them for the first year and a half of the war. The Soviets survived that, caught up, and eventually matched their foes, something the Germans don't want to admit. Yes, they were outnumbered, but what mattered was not just being outnumbered strategically, but tactically, because the Red Army is so good at deception and concentration. Thank you.
When did the Soviets begin to receive American arms and aid, and how did they adapt to it?
A very good question. The question, if you didn't hear, was when did the Soviets start to get American aid? The American and British began to push aid through even in the first 3 or 4 months of the war. However, it's problem getting it there. It has to go through either Murmansk in the north, Iran in the south. We occupied Iran during World War II, by the way, to push supplies through, or Vladivostok in the east. And that causes a delay. you can see significant numbers by mid-42, but when they're at their most desperate, we really haven't got much to them there yet, if that answers your question, I think. Also, of course, when we do get the stuff to them, they don't like it because our equipment is not necessarily designed to fit their tactics. So they think we're giving them garbage. They don't realize that we have our own design and tactical problems, okay?
How important was the delay of the assistance of the Italians in the Balkans? The war was supposed to start when the mud dried up, and it was delayed about 6 or 8 weeks.
Absolutely. It's important in two ways. The question is, how in 1941 the original plan was to invade on May 15th. But both because it was a very wet spring in the Pripyat marshes, and also, as you said, because the Italians tried to attack Greece, Greece defeated them, and Hitler loyally had to go bail his ally out, and that caused a delay. And that has a number of factors. First of all, as you say, it means that the war moves back about 5 weeks. And so they're invading the Soviet Union on exactly the same day of the year that Napoleon invaded. We all knew that was too late, right? Okay? But then, in addition to that, it causes that much more wear and tear, that many miles more, that many spare parts used up on the German vehicles, right? And it also has an effect from intelligence because Stalin received reports that they were going to attack on May 15th. When they didn't attack on May 15th, what do you suppose he said to subsequent reports? His exact words were, "Bleep your mother, you're dealing with a deception plan," So yeah, that's a key part, I think, of the German sort of error about the whole thing. Whether it would have made a difference, I don't know, but it certainly didn't help them.
What impact did the failure of the Japanese and Germans to coordinate overall broad strategy have on the ultimate German defeat?
I think that's a very good one. As I mentioned with the relationship to the Italians, Hitler was a very loyal ally. And he had urged the Japanese to attack the Americans just to distract us from him, so we wouldn't provide as much Lend-Lease and so on and so forth in 1941. But as far as I know, they did not actually tell him before Pearl Harbor. However, once they did attack at Pearl Harbor, he felt obligated to declare war on the United States. We didn't declare war on him. I think Mr. Roosevelt would have had a problem, in fact, after Pearl Harbor, convincing the public that we should fight Germany when if Germany hadn't been dumb enough, let's put it that way, to attack us. So the failure to coordinate, I think, is a big problem. However, if you may recall, and it sounds like you're probably already familiar with this, in 1939, the Japanese had challenged the Soviets in an undeclared war in Mongolia, and the young Zhukov had cleaned their clocks at a battle called Hulken-Gol. And so the Japanese army decided, let's pick on somebody easier. And they were very reluctant to go after the Soviets. So yeah, I think that failure to coordinate is again, something that in retrospect you say that might have made all the difference. We don't know for sure had the Soviets and the Germans been able to attack together, or at least coordinate what they were doing. Certainly it doesn't help to have end up in 6 months, Germany ends up fighting the two greatest industrial powers in the world, the Soviet Union and the United States. That's not good.
I understand that Stalin disposed of his high commands at one point before and during the war.
Yeah, well, there's sort of two stages of that. There's the purge, which Stalin was so paranoid, we'll never know why, whether he really believed they were a threat or whether he just plain wanted to make sure no one could be a threat. But there's estimated anywhere up to 60,000 officers who were either shot or sent to the Gulag between 1938 and 41. Now, some of them in 1941, when they could see the Germans getting ready, were released out of the Gulag and sent to the front. Konstantin Rokossovsky was taken out of prison camp, stopped off in Moscow to give him a complete set of steel teeth, like jaws, because he'd lost all his teeth in the Gulag, and then sent off to command a division. But so that's the one thing I think you're talking about. The immediate reaction after the Germans' attack is to think that when they didn't understand why they were losing, was to think that they're dealing with traitors. And so there were more than a few generals who were shot or at least relieved and imprisoned in 41. But very quickly, Stalin gets over that. I mean, we all talk about Hitler micromanaging and relieving people. when you're under pressure. Stalin had to deal with the same pressure of being about to lose in 41, and yet by the end of the year, he's starting to trust at least some of his generals. By a year later, he's trusting most of them. And so, yeah, Stalin does a better job, if you can handle this, of trusting his generals than Hitler did.
Do I understand correctly that the Soviet theory of deep battle was actually developed by the officers that were purged during the 30s?
Yeah, that's part of the problem. You're quite right. The Soviets, based on their own Civil War experience, the Russian Civil War of 1919 to 21, the Soviet officers had developed their own concept, which I tried to explain to you there briefly, had developed their own, it's sort of a variation, but not the same as Blitzkrieg. But when those people were purged, then that doctrine falls into disrepute. And you sort of don't want to, it's guilt by association. One of the things that's impressive about Zhukov is he keeps trying to follow that doctrine even when it's unpopular with Stalin. So yeah, you're right. That's part of the problem they have. They keep changing back and forth on it.
To give a little sneak preview on our March 27th program, we're going to talk about Wiedemeyer's attending the German War College. Did you comment on that, how he alerted the Americans to that new Blitzkrieg combined arms?
Well, this is a common factor. We do this today. Right now there's about 70 or 80 foreign students going to the staff college where I teach. And inevitably, as you said, they come back to the U.S. And we were talking about this, I believe, last night. Wiedemeyer claims, and Manstein claims a lot of things that he can't prove, and Wiedemeyer claims a lot of things that maybe are dubious, that he was able to draw up the plan for how we won World War II. And I think I said to you last night, in terms of absolute numbers, that is how many troops we were going to produce, he was right on the money. In terms of how we organized those troops or how we deployed them, not so much. It was just a staff exercise, the kind of thing that, and one of those things is, and something we all tend to forget is, the Germans could indeed, as Wiedemeyer was taught at the Kriegsakademie, they could take the number of troops they had and divide them up into so many divisions and so many corps headquarters. That's it. The Americans, when they have to conduct a war all over the world, where you have to project power, have to invest a lot more into logistics and building runways, and so you have a lot fewer people with sharp weapons in their hands at the end of that force, and that's something I don't think Wiedemeyer really anticipated when he did it.
But another comment, if most of the people here will be following current affairs pretty closely, the current president/general in Egypt is a graduate of the Army War College, and if you actually look at that, in many of these countries, they had their senior military training at some point either with you down at Command General Staff or at the Army War College.
Yeah, and this is one of the problems you have, particularly since the fall of the Soviet Union. The State Department has mandated that we sort of try to teach those people the American way. We take them to factories, we take them to local government, we take them on a tour of the Washington departments and try to convey the concept of civilian supremacy in defense affairs, and obviously we didn't work too well on this one, right?
Have the typical history textbooks at this point changed their accounts of the Eastern Front in terms of what happened based on some of the things we've heard today?
I will confess that I don't keep track of every survey course, but I think it's now become sufficiently widely held that people are starting to do this. But take the same token. We have a lot of stereotypes even in our own Army. If you open the average American history textbook about Vietnam, it will tell you that Special Forces are a counterinsurgency force. And anyone who's been involved in Special Forces knows that's not what they were designed to do, was it? No, they were designed to be the insurgents. So there's a lot of mistakes still out there, and I would suspect the same thing is probably true of the Soviet-German conflict. But I think we're doing better than we used to, yeah.
Step back to what a lot of us think of as the pivotal moments on the Eastern Front, Stalingrad or Kursk. And would you describe the events in those campaigns more as successes of Russian deception and intelligence or failures of German intelligence?
It's often failures of German intelligence. The Germans, I didn't make this point clear, and I probably should have. The German plan was to destroy the active Red Army. They didn't even think about, weren't even aware of the reserve armies way in the depths of the Soviet Union. So it's a failure of German intelligence. As an intel officer, I would tell you part of the problem is that in the German organizational system, the intel officer works for the operations officer and is rated by the operations officer, who feels free to disregard what the intel puke tells him anytime he wants to. Okay? But yeah, it's often a failure of German failure. And in case of Kursk particularly, and I think I said this at the time when I talked about this 5 years ago, the amazing thing about Kursk is it's the first time that any opponent of the Germans was able to predict exactly where Germany was going to attack. And for that reason, they stopped the Blitzkrieg before it ever got to the breakthrough stage. It's almost, you know, a counter-revolution in military affairs, if you will. That the Germans are, it just never occurs to them that they won't somehow break through, because they've never failed before in 4 years of war.
I have a personal recollection as a 6-year-old boy that the Germans, first of all, they stole a pig that my grandpa slaughtered, took the last meal, and also during that time winter was approaching, and they were stealing overcoats from civilians.
And shelter and
my
so on.
My grandparents lost
a
bunch of overcoats, and I don't know if I agree with you, but of the 3 million Russians who surrendered initially, they were anti-Stalin.
Yeah, you had suggested to me that some of them had felt that they were anti-Stalin, and that's what the Germans were counting on.
But the Germans started killing them off, marching them with hunger. Also, I'm sure you know that since the Germans had, 15 million of their men in the army, roughly, the factory workers were replaced by slave labor from Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. And where, as a young boy in this particular factory, my dad was a translator since he knew both German and Russian. There were 100 18-year-old girls working, making fuel tanks for the Panzers, and because there was no German labor to do all this stuff.
And this goes back to what I was trying to say about Germany doesn't have enough manpower, particularly for its industry. And you're absolutely right. Even before they invaded the Soviet Union, they had 2 million Frenchmen and other people as forced laborers. And then they probably get something like 4 million more forced Soviet laborers, many of whom did not make it home because of the harsh conditions and the starvation they were given. You know?
But the big crime was that after the war, the Russians, of course, forced all of their so-called citizens to go back to Russia, and the Americans and British allowed the Russians freedom. We were in British zone, or I was in the British zone, to force these people. And I heard I saw trains leaving with the Russian workers that were forced by the Germans to come to Germany. They were forced by the British, or allowed by the British, for the Russians to take them back to Russia, and a lot of them got shot.
Oh, absolutely. And the Russians were just totally intolerant. They assumed that anyone who had helped the Germans had done so willingly. And so, as you said, at the very least, they would be imprisoned.
In the accounts given by the German officers who were the source for much of our history on World War II, did they ever mention knowing about the sort of reputation the Russians have for brutal savagery on the battlefield? Did they ever mention that? I mean, these people fight like mad, especially when they're cornered and, up against enemies with much better weapons and tactics even, and they a lot of times win just because of that passion on the battlefield. Did they ever mention that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's a very common figure. But each side, of course, blames the other side for starting it, whereas, in fact, both sides are guilty of all kinds of atrocities and mistreatment and everything else. But you're right. I think that was commonly understood. And indeed, it's one of the reasons why the Germans last so long is that there's no thought of surrender. Most Germans and many Soviets, after the first couple of months are over, would rather die than fall into enemy hands because they know what's going to happen to them.
Whatever happened to German Chief of Staff Franz Halder? Whatever happened to him after the war?
Well, as I said, he was imprisoned and then he became a U.S. employee, and as far as I know, he died in his sleep peacefully.
In the United States?
No, in Germany. And that's true of a number of the German generals. Indeed, there were part of this problem is during the Cold War, we wanted to recreate the German army to oppose the Soviets. And so we turned a blind eye to a lot of war crimes and things like that, let convicted German generals out of prison like Manstein, and to sort of encourage the Germans to build up the West German army. So yeah, a lot of them, that you would think ought to have come to a bad end didn't.
I think that was Operation Paperclip, if I recall.
Well, that's another part. Operation Paperclip was specifically getting people that we wanted, like 150 missile designers, of whom the most famous one is Werner von Braun, brought to the U.S., and the Soviets did the same thing. The Soviets took a lot of the V-2 scientists that they captured to the Soviet Union, but they didn't trust them as much as we trusted ours. But yeah, there were a lot of specialists that, Werner von Braun, for example, should have been imprisoned because they used forced labor to operate the missile factories, and he was in charge of it. But he got away clean, as far as I know.
I was wondering if you could put Snyder's Bloodlands in context to this, and I have a second, more personal question, is how you feel your academic training at the University of Michigan fits in with what you're doing now.
Yeah. I hesitate to. Bloodlands is an interesting sort of effort to try and give you the gut level view of things, and that's not really what I'm trying to do, so I'm not sure I can make a useful comparison. I got a lot of training. First of all, I got taught how to write, which is very important in college as an undergraduate. And then in graduate school, I was exposed to two fine men, one of whom is very famous, John Shai, and some of you may know, and the other one nobody's ever heard of, John Bowditch, who had both been officers themselves, and they taught me a heck of a lot about military history and the way that armies operated. And I never really realized how lucky I was to know at the age of 23 stuff that most people don't figure out till their 30s or 40s.
I know that you stated the reluctance of the Germans and the Soviets both to be captured. Was it worse for German POWs or Soviet POWs?
Believe it or not, there is a lower percentage of Soviets who fell into German hands who survived than the reverse. Something like 57% of Soviet citizens and POWs died in German hands. And that is, you can blame the Einsatzgruppen, but I think it's a principle of international law that if you take the man prisoner, you're responsible for him. Even if you turn him over to somebody else, it's still your responsibility if his rights are violated. And so, yeah, I think that the Soviets suffered more.
You had mentioned the foreign students attending the Command and Staff College at Leavenworth. Mm-hmm. How are they, is there a vetting process, an application process? Is it by invitation only? Who decides who is allowed in? How does that happen?
In most cases, it's a matter of, diplomatic arrangement, who gets how many people each country can send. And then the country itself almost always gets to choose the person. The only requirement we put on is they have to usually pass an English as a second language test. And sometimes it's pretty flaky about that. I had a Japanese officer last year, and I don't blame him in the least, who had a great deal of difficulty understanding what was going on. Eventually, I just let him brief in Japanese, and then an American Marine who had studied Japanese would translate for him afterwards because he had so much trouble. But we don't hand-pick them, no. But what you find, as Don mentioned, is disproportionately, those guys are the very best in their service. They often show us up. They're often best in the class. And they go back and, generally speaking, become very senior in their armed forces. Right. For those of you who don't know, I knew Hal Deutsch when I was a very junior officer. He was a very impressive guy who had actually been a witness to history in a way that most of us can't. He had actually interviewed Ludendorff, for example, and things like that as a young graduate student. And so I think a great deal of him and of this whole program. So thank you.